The wedding car was still running when Lena Moretti found him, headlights on, engine idling low, like it was waiting for someone who was never going to come back for it. Rain had soaked the white roses across the hood until they sagged against the black paint, and the lavender-white ribbons on the grille had come loose at one end and were dragging through a puddle over and over in the wind. Nobody else was in the alley. That was the first thing that felt wrong. A wedding car parked like that, at that hour, should have had people around it. A driver, a coordinator, someone smoking a cigarette and checking a watch. Instead, there was a man sitting against the brick wall with his knees drawn up and one hand pressed hard over his face, soaked through his pale grey suit, and a second man standing several yards back under an awning, motionless, watching the street in both directions like he expected someone to come out of it. Lena had walked past worse things in this city and kept walking. She almost did it again. Then the crying man's shoulders moved, and she understood it wasn't the sound of someone composing himself. It was the sound of someone coming apart. She set her garment bag down against the wall, out of the wet, and knelt on the cobblestones beside him. "Are you hurt?" Nothing, not even a flinch. Up close, she could see his hands were shaking too hard for a man, just cold from the rain, and there was a wedding ring, brand new, no wear on it yet, turning slowly on his finger where he kept twisting it without seeming to know he was doing it. She put her arm around him. He went completely still, the way an animal goes, still right before it decides whether to run or not. Lena kept her arm where it was, kept her voice out of it entirely, and waited. A long 5 seconds passed. Then his hand shot up and closed around her wrist, not gently, and he held on like he thought she might disappear if he let go, the same way everyone else apparently had that day. She glanced past him at the man under the awning. He hadn't moved either, but he was watching her now instead of the street, and there was something in the way he watched, cataloguing her, weighing her, that told Lena this was not a man who guarded weddings. This was a man who guarded someone worth being afraid for. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments which country you're watching this from and what time it is where you are right now. I read every single one. Or aga ap kuye kahani pasandar hai to comment main zarur batai ap kahan se dik rahi hain. Lena had no business being in that alley at all, except that it was the fastest way back from Calderon Street, where she delivered an altered gown 20 minutes earlier to a client whose patience did not extend past its due date. She had been a seamstress in wealthy houses since she was 19, and the trade had taught her exactly one thing that mattered more than her stitching. Rich people forget you're in the room the moment you kneel down, and they say things in front of you they would never say in front of each other. 3 months before that afternoon, a woman named Bianca Valenti had come in for her first fitting, and in every session after that, Lena had noticed something building underneath the silk. The sleeves kept long past the point of fashion. The questions that didn't belong in a bridal fitting. Can a seam be opened without anyone noticing? If someone wanted to leave a wedding without being followed, what would she wear? Lena had mentioned it once to Signora Bellini, who ran the workroom and had strong opinions about staying alive in it. She's frightened of something, Lena had said. She is a bride, Signora Bellini answered, not looking up. Our work is the dress, not the woman in it. You start guessing at what frightens our clients, Lena, and this family stopped sending for us. And every family like it here's why. Lena had nodded and said nothing more, and gone on pinning hems. It felt, at the time, like the only sensible choice available to a woman with a mother to support and 4 girls behind her in line for the same job. It stopped feeling sensible 2 nights before the wedding, when Bianca had gone rigid under Lena's hands and said, so quietly it barely carried, "If I don't walk down that aisle tomorrow, don't believe I stopped loving him." Then why would you leave? Bianca had only looked toward the door, the way she always did, every fitting, like she was counting how long it would take someone to cross the room, and said nothing else. Lena had let it go. That was the second mistake. The sound that pulled her into this alley had reached her from a block away. A church going in the space of a few seconds from silence to 100 voices talking over each other, and then one voice cutting through all of it, raw and furious with grief. She had followed it without deciding to, and found the side street behind the church instead of the church itself, and the running car, and the man on the ground. He apologized first, once he could speak. "I'm sorry. This isn't something I do. You don't owe me an explanation. He lifted his head and looked at her properly for the first time, and something about his face told Lena that whoever he was, people were supposed to know it on sight. She didn't. Dante Romano, he said, watching her closely as he said it, testing the name against her, the way you'd test a weapon to see if it still worked. It didn't land the way he expected. Lance's expression didn't change at all. Behind him, the man under the awning shifted his weight just slightly, and Lena understood, with the same instinct that told her Asim was wrong before she could say why, that she had just failed to react the way everyone else in this man's life reacted, and the both of them had noticed. You worked on her dress, Dante said. Not a question. You're the seamstress from Calderon Street. Lena's stomach went cold. Yes. His voice dropped lower and quieter, which made it worse, not better. Was she happy in the fittings, or was she pretending? And every one of us just let her. Somewhere behind her ribs, Signora Bellini's voice said, "Our work is the dress, not the woman in it." And somewhere ahead of it, a locked door in a fitting room said what would she wear if she wanted to leave without being followed. Lena knelt in the rain and understood with total clarity that whatever she said next was not going to end in this alley. No, she said. She wasn't happy. Not for weeks. Dante Romano went very still, and behind him, so did the man in the sunglasses, in a way that had nothing to do with grief at all. The rain had stopped by the time Dante's man drove her home, though nobody had asked if she wanted a ride. And nobody had asked her to refuse it either. Lena sat in the back of a car that smelled of leather and something colder underneath it, and thought about the 3 months before that alley, the ones that had let her into it without her noticing she was walking there. It had started with the sleeves. Bianca's gown was cut in the old style, close through the bodice, and the sleeves should have needed only the smallest correction after the first fitting. Instead, Lena adjusted them twice more, an inch longer, then longer again, until they sat past the wrist bone in a way no bridal magazine would have approved. "You're covering something," Lena said the third time, pins between her lips. Not quite a question. "I bruise easily," Bianca said. "I always have." Lena had pinned the hem and said nothing, because Signora Bellini's voice was already in her head before Bianca had finished the sentence. "Our work is the dress, not the woman in it." But she began writing things down that night anyway, in a notebook she kept at the bottom of her sewing basket under the spools. Sleeves again. Bruise, left forearm yellowing, old. She told herself it was habit, the way a seamstress remembers a client's preferences season to season. She did not fully believe herself. The dress had to be taken in twice more after that. At the waist, because Bianca kept losing weight she didn't have to lose. And once. Only once. Lena found a seam at the underarm that had been picked apart from the inside crudely, with something that wasn't a proper seam ripper, and mended just as crudely, as if someone had needed to open the dress in private and close it again before anyone noticed. Bianca asked for a pocket after that. Small, inside the left side seam, invisible from without. For what? Lena had asked. A woman should have somewhere to keep something that's only hers, Bianca said, and did not elaborate, and Lena did not ask twice. If this is your first time watching, drop your country and the time where you are. I promise I read every comment. Ora ga hani, achi la grahi hai twa zarur batain, gahanse dek rahi hain. You listen too well, Signora Bellini told her one evening when the workroom had emptied and it was only the two of them and the last gown on its stand. That is the gift and the danger of this trade. People tell us nothing, Lena, because they've decided we are furniture that happens to sew. But you listen anyway. I've watched you do it for 3 years. Is that a warning? It's an observation. Signora Bellini did not look up from her needle. The warning is this. The day you carry a rich family's secret out of a fitting room is the day you lose your place inside every fitting room in this city. Word travels faster among them than it does among us. You understand? I understand. Then forget whatever it is you think you've noticed. Lena had not forgotten it. She had simply stopped saying it out loud. She heard Dante Romano's name the way you hear weather, constantly, and from every direction, each account slightly different from the last. The butcher's wife called him a monster who'd had 2 men disappeared over a debt. The client's driver called him the only reason the docks hadn't been carved up by outsiders in a decade. Signora Bellini, who said little about anything, said only that the Romanos paid on time and never asked a seamstress to lie for them, which apparently made him a gentleman by the standards Lena's trade had learned to expect. Everyone agreed he was cold. Nobody who knew him personally called him cruel. Bianca never called him anything at all, except once, when she said his name the way a person says the name of weather they've decided to trust, storm or not. The other woman's name came to Lena in pieces, over weeks, the way most things in that house did. Elena Ricci, Dante's fiancée, 5 years before Bianca, gone on the morning of her own wedding. Not a scandal exactly, because scandal requires witnesses willing to talk, and no one in that family talked. The city had filled in the silence itself. She'd taken money, or another man, or simply her freedom, and Dante had let the story stand uncorrected, which everyone took as confirmation. He believes she betrayed him, Bianca said during a fitting in the 6th week, apropos of nothing Lena had asked. Did she? Bianca's hands went still on the fabric in her lap. That is the question he should have asked 5 years ago. She did not say anything else, and the silence that followed had the particular weight of a door being shut carefully so as not to make a sound. The photograph was folded into a square the size of a postage stamp, and Lena found it only because the knee pocket needed a final stitch to close, and something inside it stopped the needle. She should not have opened it. She told herself that even as she did, 3 men, younger, standing in front of a building she didn't recognize. She knew 2 of the faces before she understood what she was looking at. Dante's father, unmistakable, even younger, and beside him a man she had spent 19 years calling Papa in a suit she'd never seen him own, his hand resting on the shoulder of a 3rd man, whose face meant nothing to her at all. She sat, very still, the needle forgotten between her fingers, and did not know which was worse, that her father was in the photograph, or that some old, quiet part of her had already known, before she recognized his face, that whatever this was, it had always been going to reach her eventually. Bianca found her like that. She didn't ask what Lena had seen. She only crossed the room quickly and closed her hand around Lena's wrist. If I disappear tomorrow, she said, low and fast, don't let Dante destroy the wrong person. Lena opened her mouth, but Bianca wasn't finished. Her grip tightened, and for the first time in 3 months her voice wasn't careful at all. Your father knew why Elena ran. The morning of the wedding, Bianca's hands were so cold that Lena had to warm the buttons between her own palms before she could fasten them. You're freezing, Lena said. I'm fine. Bianca's eyes went to the doorway of the bridal room, the way they always went to doorways, and stayed there a beat too long. Is it time? Not yet. Bianca nodded and looked at the door again anyway, as though time were a thing that might arrive early through it. The church had filled with the particular tension of an event everyone has agreed to pretend is joyful. Lena had felt it the moment she carried the gown in. Something wrong under the flowers and the organ music, the kind of wrongness she'd learned to read in fabric, long before she learned to read it in rooms. A man she didn't recognize appeared in the corridor outside the bridal suite not long after. Middle-aged, unremarkable, the sort of face built to be forgotten. He said something to Bianca too quietly for Lena to catch, and Bianca's composure came apart in real time, her spine straightening, her breath going shallow, her hand finding the doorframe as though the floor had tilted under her. He left as quietly as he'd come. If this is your first time watching, drop your country and the time where you are. I promise I read every comment. U aga kahani, achi lagrahai, tuasaru batain, kahan se dekrahai. For a few seconds they were alone. Bianca turned to her with an expression Lena hadn't seen on her before. Not fear, exactly, but the look of someone standing at the edge of a decision, weighing what it would cost to speak against what it would cost not to. Lena, I need to tell you. Footsteps in the corridor. 2 sets, unhurried, coming closer. Lena dropped to her knees on instinct and busied her hands with the hem, the oldest reflex of her trade. Become furniture. Become invisible. Let the room forget you're in it. Bianca's whole body went still above her. The footsteps passed the door without stopping. When Lena looked up, Bianca was staring at nothing, and whatever door had been open in her a moment ago had shut again. Tell Dante to remember the first wedding, she whispered. Bianca. But someone was calling her name. from the hallway, bright and ceremonial. 5 minutes, the car is ready, and Bianca smoothed her own skirt with hands that were shaking again and walked out. She never reached the aisle. The guests waited the way guests always wait. First patiently, then with glances exchanged, then with a silence that had its own weight. Dante stood at the altar and did not move, did not check his watch, did not send anyone to look for her, as though some part of him had already understood before anyone came to tell him. Someone finally did. Lena watched it reach him from across the church, watched something close behind his eyes, and then he turned and walked out through the side door, and the wedding, in every sense that mattered, ended right there. She followed the sound he made into the alley. The rest, Lena already knew. "You're the seamstress from Calderon Street," Dante said again now, later, once the rain had thinned to nothing and the church bells had stopped confusing themselves for hope. "Tell me what you saw." She was afraid, Lena said, for weeks. Not of the wedding, of something else. Of me. No. Lena said it before she'd decided to. Not of you. I don't think she was ever afraid of you. Something shifted in his face. Not relief. Nothing so simple, but a kind of attention she hadn't had from him before. Then who? I don't know his name. She thought of the man in the corridor, forgettable on purpose, but she reacted every time he appeared, like her body knew him before she let herself react. Behind Dante, the man under the awning had come closer without seeming to move, the way certain men learn to close distance, so it doesn't look like they've closed it. Up close, he was perhaps 38, built like a door, with eyes that did the same cataloging work. Lena's did, only faster and without apology. "Marco Bellini," Dante said, by way of introduction. "He notices things." "So does she," Marco said, watching Lena with an attention that had nothing to do with grief. Then, quieter, almost to himself, "Bellini, not the workroom Bellini. My employer," Lena said. "No relation as far as I know." Marco's expression didn't change, but something behind it filed the answer away for later use. Dante sent for the gown himself. It arrived still creased from where Bianca had stepped out of it that morning, and he found the hidden pocket the way a man finds something he already suspects is there. Quickly, without searching. The photograph was inside, but it wasn't the photograph Lena had seen. The third man's face had been scratched away, gouged out with something sharp enough to tear the paper, leaving a raw white wound where a stranger's features used to be. Tucked beneath it, a note in handwriting Lena didn't recognize. "Ask what happened the first time." Dante went very still. The same stillness Lena had seen in the alley, except this time it didn't look like grief. It looked like memory. 5 years ago, he said, another bride disappeared on my wedding day. Lena felt the floor of the conversation shift under her, the way it had for Bianca in that corridor. "Elena Ricci, you know the name." Bianca said it once. Lena's mind was already moving faster than she wanted it to. This isn't random. Someone is doing this on purpose. Twice. Yes. Dante's eyes came up to hers, and there was something in them now that hadn't been there in the alley. Not grief, not even suspicion, but a terrible, careful calculation, as though he were rebuilding a structure in his head one beam at a time and didn't yet like what it was becoming. "The photograph," he said slowly. "2 men and my father." Bianca hid it in her dress for a reason. He looked at her the way Marco had looked at her name a moment ago, recalculating. "Your father was involved in that wedding too," Dante said. 5 years ago, the first time a bride vanished from my life. Your father was there." "Say that again." "You heard me." Dante's voice hadn't risen, but something underneath it had gone very quiet, in a way that made Marco shift his weight near the doorway. "Your father was a tailor to my family for 11 years, Dante said. "He fitted my father's suits. He was in rooms with us that no one outside the family was ever permitted to enter, and you're telling me you didn't know that?" "I was 7 when he left," Lena said. "I know he sewed for wealthy men. I didn't know which ones. If you're new here, tell me your country and the time where you are. I read every comment, I promise." "Arachkahani pasandaha wa hihaitos out wurbatei kahanse da shihayen." Matteo Moretti had not simply measured shoulders and hemmed trousers. A tailor who is trusted enough gets waved into rooms other men are kept out of. He is furniture, the same as a seamstress. The same as Lena had learned to be before she understood where the lesson came from. Matteo had stood in studies and private offices with a mouthful of pins, listening to men who had forgotten he had ears at all. And somewhere in those 11 years he had heard something he wasn't meant to hear. That someone inside the Romano family itself was passing information to a rival house. He hadn't gone to Dante's father with it. Not right away. He'd started writing it down instead. Dates, names, half-sentences overheard through a fitting room door, hidden inside the pages of an ordinary tailoring ledger, disguised among measurements and fabric orders where no one would think to look twice. Then one winter, he had simply stopped coming home. Lena's mother had been told he'd left them. Run off, the story went, the way men sometimes did. A debt, a woman, a weakness nobody had seen coming. Lena had been too young to argue, and old enough to know, in the wordless way, children know things, that the story didn't fit the man who used to sing to her while he threaded a needle. She had carried that certainty for 19 years without anywhere to put it. Dante and Marco spent the better part of 2 days in the Romano family's old records. Ledgers, correspondence, the household accounts nobody had opened since before Dante inherited any of it. Matteo Moretti's name surfaced twice, once as a line item, tailoring services paid in full, and once buried in a guest register from 5 years earlier, on the same week as a wedding that never happened. Elena contacted him, Dante said, laying the register flat on the table between them. 3 days before our wedding, there's a note in the household diary, a fitting requested outside the usual schedule. My mother's handwriting. She thought it was strange enough to mark it. He looked up at Lena. Elena went to your father. Marco, who had said almost nothing through both days of searching, finally spoke, which means Elena didn't run because she stops loving you. She ran because your tailor told her something that made staying dangerous. It matched what Bianca had learned too. Once the pieces were set beside each other, Bianca had discovered. Lena didn't yet know how. That Elena hadn't betrayed Dante at all. Elena had disappeared because she'd found out that someone close to Dante, someone trusted, had arranged for Matteo Moretti to vanish before he could expose what he knew. And staying, for Elena, had meant standing in a house where that same person still walked freely. They weren't running from you, Lena said quietly. Either of them. They were running from whoever made my father disappear. Dante didn't answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice had lost its edge entirely. I spent 5 years believing Elena chose to humiliate me. I built the rest of my life around that belief. I made it into a rule. That betrayal is what people do, eventually, if you let them close enough. He looked, briefly, like a much younger man. It was never true. I just needed it to be simpler than this. He straightened before the moment could go any further, and the version of him that gave orders returned to his face. You'll stay at the estate until this is finished. Marco will arrange it. No, he looked at her the way she suspected. Very few people had looked at him in a very long time. This isn't a request, Lena. I didn't ask if it was. She held his gaze and didn't drop her voice the way every instinct her trade had taught her said she should. You don't get to decide what happens to me just because everyone else obeys you. My father is missing because of whatever this is. That makes it mine too, not something you manage for me. Marco, in the corner, went very still, the particular stillness of a man watching something he hadn't expected to see twice in one lifetime. Dante said nothing for a long moment. He wasn't angry, which surprised her more than anger would have. Something in his face had simply gone quiet the way a room goes quiet when a door that's been stuck finally opens. Nobody spoke to him like that. Nobody had, in longer than he could easily count. Not his men, not his mother, not even Bianca, who had loved him carefully, the way you love something you're also afraid of breaking. Lena wasn't careful with him at all, and it was, he realized with some discomfort, the first wholly honest conversation he'd had in years. Fine, he said. You'll stay, but you'll be protected whether you agree to it or not. But it wasn't a compromise so much as the shape one takes when neither side is willing to lose entirely. And something about that, the fact that he bent it all, sat strangely in Lena's chest for the rest of the evening. Over the following days, something shifted between them that neither named. Dante began speaking to her without the performance he wore for everyone else. Admitted once that he hadn't slept properly in a week, in a voice that sounded almost like an apology for saying so out loud. Lena watched the exhaustion move under his composure and stopped seeing, quite so simply, the monster the butcher's wife had described. He grew protective of her in small, unannounced ways. A car sent without being asked for, a door checked twice, but never once told her where she could or couldn't go. Marco noticed. Marco noticed everything and said nothing, which, from him, was its own kind of comment. It was Marco who finally found the ledger, in a crate of Matteo's old workroom effects the Romanos had kept, without quite knowing why. Lena's hands shook when she opened it. One page near the back listed 2 dates in her father's careful hand. Elena Ricci, wedding day. Bianca Valenti, wedding day, under both names. The same symbol, drawn small and precise, like something copied rather than invented. Lena's eyes moved further down the page to a third line her father had written beneath the other 2, and the room seemed to tilt the way it had for Bianca in that corridor, the floor going unsteady beneath a truth she wasn't ready to stand on. Lena Moretti. The warehouse smelled of dust and old dye, the particular staleness of a place shut for years but never quite emptied. Matteo's name was still stenciled on a crate near the door, half-eaten by damp. He kept a second workshop, Dante said, low, scanning the dark rows of shelving. Nobody knew. I didn't either, Lena said, and meant it, though something in her chest had already started bracing for whatever they were about to find. They found more than she expected. Bolts of fabric gone stiff with age. Patterns pinned to boards that had once been someone's careful geometry. But behind a false panel in the back wall, Matteo's true work waited. Folders of documents, photographs clipped together with rusted pins, coded ledgers of payments that meant nothing to Lena, and everything, judging by his face, to Dante. Wedding schedules, surveillance notes, dated and initialed, tracking movements of women Lena had never met. If this is your first time here, tell me your country and the time where you are. I read every comment. I promise. Auraga kahani pasanda rahai hai tu zarora batayin, kahan se dik rahi hain. Marco found the page that changed everything. He went still over it long enough that Dante crossed the room to see what had stopped him. Marco Bellini's name, written twice. Once beside Elena Ricci's wedding date, once beside Bianca's. Explain this. Dante's voice had gone to the flat, dangerous register Lena had heard only once before, in the alley, aimed at nothing. Marco didn't answer. His jaw worked once, and he looked, for the first time since Lena had met him, like a man deciding how much of himself he was willing to lose in the next 30 seconds. Marco, I can't explain it the way you want me to, Marco said finally. Lena had already leaned closer to the page, her eyes moving the way they moved over a hem that didn't sit right. This isn't the same hand, she said, before she'd fully decided to speak. Both men looked at her. The other entries, the dates, the surveillance notes. They're written in one hand, careful, even spacing. The pen never pressed too hard. She traced a finger an inch above the paper, not touching it. Marco's name is written differently, heavier on the downstrokes, written fast, like someone adding it after the fact. She looked up. I spend my life reading handwriting on pattern notes, Dante. Whoever wrote your name into that book, she nodded at Marco, didn't write the rest of this ledger. Marco's expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders loosened, very slightly, the way a man's does when someone has said the thing he couldn't say for himself. I helped Elena leave, he said, 5 years ago. I got her out of the city before the wedding, and I never told you where, and I let you believe whatever you needed to believe, because the truth was more dangerous to her than your anger was to me. He didn't look away from Dante as he said it. I helped Bianca too. 2 days before your second wedding, she came to me and asked for the same thing I'd given Elena. I gave it to her. You let me stand at that altar. Dante's voice had dropped to something almost too quiet to hear. Twice. You let me believe. I let you believe a lie that kept 2 women alive, Marco said. I would do it again. Why? Dante's hands had curled at his sides. Why would either of them need to run from my own house? Because I found out someone inside your family was having them watched before either wedding. Someone who wanted them gone, and wanted it to look like betrayal, not disappearance. Marco's control cracked, just barely around the edges. I was trying to find out who. I hadn't finished. I was going to tell you the moment I had a name instead of a suspicion, because a suspicion in your hands right now would have gotten someone killed for the wrong reason. Who? Dante said. Not a question, a demand. The lights went out. All of them, at once, the warehouse dropping into a dark so complete Lena felt it against her skin before her mind caught up to what had happened. Then a gunshot cracked through it close enough that the sound seemed to happen inside her chest rather than in the air, and Dante's arm came around her and pulled her down and back in the same motion, folding her against the shelving with his body between her and the open floor. Marco's return fire came a half-second later. 2 shots, controlled, aimed at a doorway Lena couldn't see. Boots scraped somewhere near the loading entrance, fast uneven receding, and then the warehouse door groaned open and shut again, and the only sound left was Dante's breathing too close to her ear, and her own heartbeat trying to climb out of her throat. "Stay down," Dante said, though she hadn't moved. Marco's flashlight found them a moment later, steady despite everything. "He's gone. I'm not chasing him blind through a building I don't know." Nobody argued with him. It was Lena who saw it first. Once the lights came back, a scrap of fabric snagged on the corner of a shelf, torn free in whatever struggle had happened in the dark before the shot. She crossed to it and picked it up before either man could stop her, turned it over in her fingers with the same automatic care she gave any fabric that crossed her hands. She knew it immediately. Fine wool, a particular weave she'd handled dozens of times because she'd once mended a coat cut from the same bolt. "This is Romano cloth," she said. "Bespoke. I have worked on it before." Her stomach had already gone cold before she finished the sentence. "It's from your uncle's coat." Dante crossed the room and took the fabric from her hand, and for a long moment he simply looked at it, as though looking hard enough might change what it was made of. "No," he said. "Dante, my uncle raised me." His voice had gone rough in a way she hadn't heard from him even in the alley. "After my father died, he was the one who sat with me every night for a year, until I stopped waking up screaming. He taught me how to run this family before I was old enough to want to. There are men in this city I can imagine betraying me without much effort at all." He set the fabric down on the crate between them, carefully, as though it might still be capable of hurting someone. "He isn't one of them." Lena looked at the torn scrap of wool, and then at him, and didn't reach for the comfort of agreeing with him, because comfort wasn't what either of them needed right now. "That," she said quietly, "is exactly why it would work." Nobody spoke on the drive back. Dante sat with the torn scrap of wool folded in his fist, and Lena watched the city move past the window and thought about her father's ledger and how long a man could carry a secret before it finally decided to surface on its own terms instead of his. It was Marco who found the rest of it in the end. A locked drawer in the uncle's study that hadn't been opened in years, forced with the same efficient calm he did everything with. Bank transfers to a rival family, dated back further than either failed wedding, threats disguised as correspondence. A photograph of Matteo Moretti, the same one Bianca had hidden in her gown, except this copy still had all 3 faces intact. If this is your first time here, drop your country and the time where you are. I read every comment, I promise. Oraga hani pasand ada rahihai ta asaror batayin, kahanze dik rahihain. The truth, once it was laid out on the study table in pieces, was uglier than betrayal. It was patience. Dante's uncle had never wanted him dead. A dead nephew was worth nothing. A nephew who trusted no one outside the family, who believed, bone deep from experience, not instruction, that love from beyond these walls always ended in disappearance or ruin, was worth everything. Every wedding that collapsed made Dante smaller in the exact places his uncle needed him. Small, isolated, suspicious, folded ever more tightly back into the family that had apparently engineered the isolation in the first place. Elena had found the financial arrangement first, a name on a transfer that didn't belong where it was, and she'd been threatened quietly enough that no one else ever heard it happen. Marco had gotten her out before the wedding, and Dante had been left to fill the silence with the only story anyone offered him, that she hadn't loved him enough to stay. Bianca had found Elena years later, in whatever city she'd rebuilt a life in, and Elena, after enough time to decide the risk was worth it, had told her everything. Bianca hadn't run from fear of Dante. she'd been building toward exposing his uncle when the uncle found out and made the threat personal, not to her, but to her family. The same threat that had likely reached Matteo Moretti before he vanished. She had disappeared to keep them breathing, and left a note in the one place she trusted would eventually reach the man who needed to read it. And Matteo. Matteo had simply refused to hand over what he knew, even when refusing cost him everything. He had hidden the evidence instead of surrendering it, and the uncle had made sure he never got the chance to use it. Dante sat with all of it laid out in front of him and said nothing for a long time. 5 years, he said finally. I hated a woman who spent her wedding morning trying to save me from my own family. His voice had gone hollow in a way Lena hadn't heard from him, even in the alley. Bianca gave up her name, her reputation, everyone's belief that she was capable of loving someone to protect me, and I let this city call her a coward for it. You didn't know. I didn't want to know. He looked at his hands. It was easier to believe they left because that's what people do. It meant I never had to ask what I might have done to make it easier for someone to leave. He looked up at her, and for once there was nothing composed left in his face at all. I thought everyone betrayed me because I was Dante Romano, because of what I carry, what I am. Maybe, Lena said quietly. Everyone betrayed you because someone taught you to expect it, long before you ever had a name that meant anything. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Something in his face had already agreed with her before she finished saying it. The confrontation, when it came, was quieter than Lena expected. Dante's uncle didn't deny anything once the evidence was in front of him. He simply straightened his cuffs and hurried, the way a man does when he's already decided the conversation isn't a negotiation he intends to lose emotionally, even if he's lost it practically. You'd be nothing without what I built around you, he said. No wife, no rival, no outside pull strong enough to make you soft. I made you the man this family needed. You made me alone, Dante said. That isn't the same thing. He didn't reach for a weapon. Marco, standing behind him, didn't need to be told what Dante had decided. Something in the set of his shoulders had already told him. Dante had spent his whole life being taught that betrayal ended in blood, that this was simply how the ledger balanced. He chose, instead, to hand every document across the table to men who would make sure his uncle never again occupied a room where a decision like this could be made in silence. You could have killed him, Marco said. Once it was done, once the uncle had been taken out through the same doors he'd once walked through as the man who raised him. I could have, Dante agreed. That would have made me exactly what he spent 20 years training me to become. He didn't look particularly proud of the restraint. He looked tired, in the way of a man who has just set down something heavy he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten. It had weight. He found Lena on the terrace afterward. The city gone quiet below them in the way cities go quiet, only after something in them has finally stopped holding its breath. The danger's over, he said. You could go home now, back to the workroom, your mother, your life before any of this. He said it carefully, like a man offering something he wasn't sure he wanted accepted. I know, but you're still here. I am. She held his gaze, steady, the same steadiness she'd used on him in the alley the first night, when his name hadn't landed on her the way it landed on everyone else. Don't mistake staying for forgiveness, Dante. What happened to my father? I haven't made peace with that. I'm not sure I ever will. I wouldn't dare, he said. And for the first time since the wedding car had idled in that rain-soaked alley, something in his face came close to being at rest. Elena Ricci came home on a Thursday, quietly, the way a truth arrives after it's spent 5 years learning to be careful. Bianca followed 2 weeks later, thinner than Lena remembered from the fittings, but standing straighter than she ever had in that workroom, as though some weight had finally been set down and someone else had agreed to carry it. Dante did not do it privately. That surprised Lena more than almost anything else he'd done since the alley. That a man built on silence and inherited caution would choose deliberately to stand in front of the same city that had spent 5 years calling Elena a coward and say plainly that he had been wrong. She never betrayed me, he told him. The family, the old associates, the people whose good opinion had once been the only currency he understood. She left because staying would have gotten her killed, and I let this city punish her for surviving. That's mine to correct, not hers to keep carrying. If this is your first time here, tell me your country and the time where you are. I read every single comment, I promise. O agar kahani pasanda rahi hai twas arua batain, kahan se di karahi hain. He told the truth about Bianca too. Not all of it. Not the parts that belonged only to her, but enough that the city understood she hadn't run from love. She'd run toward protecting it, and paid for that with her name for longer than anyone should have to. Lena's truth came to her more quietly, in Dante's study, on an evening when the light had gone the particular gold that only showed up an hour before dusk. He set a ledger on the desk between them, her father's, worn soft at the corners, the same one Marco had found in the crate of old workroom effects. There's a page near the back, Dante said. I didn't read past the first line. I thought you should be the one to. Her father had died protecting it. That was the whole of it, in the end. Stripped of the years of not knowing that had sat in Lena's chest like a stone she'd stopped noticing the weight of. The uncle had ordered him found, and Matteo had refused. Even at the end, even when refusing cost him the only life he had, to hand over evidence that would have implicated Dante's father alongside the rest. He had died keeping a secret that wasn't fully his to keep, because somewhere in 11 years of fitting rich men for suits, he had decided that some kinds of loyalty were worth more than his own safety. Folded into the ledger's last page was a note, ink faded but legible, addressed to a wife he never got to see again. If Lena ever learns the truth, tell her I was trying to leave for a world where she could choose who to trust. Lena read it twice, then a third time, and did not cry the way she'd expected to. What she felt instead was something steadier, the sense of a door closing gently on a room she'd spent 19 years standing outside of, unable to see in. Dante changed after that, in ways that weren't loud, but were unmistakable if you'd known him before. He went through his uncle's old network with the same patience Matteo had once used to catalog betrayal, and removed what needed removing. Not with the blade his uncle had trained him to reach for first, but with the slower, harder work of simply refusing to keep men close who had only ever obeyed him out of fear. He stopped mistaking loyalty for obedience. He started noticing who stayed when nothing was owed to them, and treated that noticing like something worth protecting. I want you to stay, he told Lena one evening, without any of the ceremonies she half expected from a man of his position. Not as someone I'm protecting, not as an employee or a debt or whatever this looked like from the outside. He said it plainly, the way he'd learned, somewhere in the last months, to say things that mattered without armoring them first. As an equal. If you'll have that. I won't become a Mafia princess, Lena said, just because you decided you love me. Something in his face came close to a smile, the first genuine one she'd seen from him, unguarded. I wasn't asking for a princess. Then what were you asking for? The woman who hugged me when I was nobody. You weren't nobody. I was to you. He said it without self-pity, just fact. You didn't know my name. You knelt down anyway. No, Lena said, and reached for his hand the way she had that first night. Except this time neither of them was kneeling in the rain. You were just a man who was hurting. That was all I saw. Months later, she went back to the alley. She hadn't meant to make a ritual of it, but her feet had carried her there on an ordinary afternoon, the kind with nothing urgent pulling at either end of it, and she'd let them. The bricks were dry now, warmed by a sun that had no memory of that night's rain. No wedding car idled at the curb. No white roses sagged against black paint. No ribbons dragged through puddles. Just an ordinary alley, quiet. The kind a person might walk past 100 times without once looking twice. Dante was already there when she arrived, leaning against the same wall. He'd once slid down in his ruined pale grey soutans in his pockets, watching her come toward him the way he'd learned to watch things now. Not cataloguing, not weighing, just watching. I used to think I'd forget this place, he said, once she reached him. I didn't want to remember it. A man on the ground, falling apart in an alley. I thought that was the worst version of myself the world would ever see. He looked around at the dry brick, the ordinary light. I was wrong. It was the first time in years someone touched me without wanting anything back. I didn't know who you were. That's why it mattered. He reached for her hand, and Lena noticed. The way she noticed everything. The small physical truths that told her more than words ever managed to. That he didn't grip it the way he had that first night, desperate, like she might vanish if he let go. He simply held it, steady, certain that she'd still be there in an hour, in a year, without needing to hold on hard enough to guarantee it. She thought standing there about all the fittings that had led her to this, the sleeves adjusted past reason, the hidden pocket, the photograph she was never meant to find, her father's ledger, with her own name written at the bottom of a page he'd hoped she'd never have to read. She had thought, that first rain-soaked afternoon, that she was simply helping a stranger who'd come apart in an alley. She hadn't known she was stepping into the middle of a 5-year-old wound that had never been allowed to close. And Dante, the feared Mafia boss the whole city agreed was cold. The man who'd built his entire life around the certainty that everyone eventually left, had spent those same months learning the one thing his uncle had made sure he never learned as a boy. Being loved was not the same thing as being controlled. He held her hand loosely the way you hold something you trust will stay on its own, and neither of them said anything else because for the first time since that wedding car had idled in the rain, there was nothing left that needed saying.